The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
Okay, good afternoon. So in the last couple of weeks, we've gone through some of the major human capacities that you have and I have, and most people have most of them, right? Which are the ability to see the world around us, to attend to what's important, to learn lessons from life, to remember things while we sometimes forget things. And today we're going to talk about another huge dimension of human experience, of the human mind, of the human brain, language. The ability to talk to one another, I can talk, you can listen, and vice versa, to read, to communicate in the ways that are so remarkable. Our life is flooded with language, right? That we hear, that we read, and so on. So when psychologists try to sort of divide up language into studyable components, they talk about comprehension, understanding what somebody says to you when you're an infant, or now as an adult, or reading text, or producing speech, which you can do with your mouth by speaking, or you learn to write. So you can both comprehend and produce language, both visually and orally. And a thing that has, greatly enamored linguists to figure out is how a language that we speak is endlessly generative. I'm not sure you can actually calculate out how many sentences we could possibly produce, but just for fun, people have done stuff, and they said it would take 100 trillion years to memorize all the sentences we can produce. I'm not sure that's exactly the right number, but it's a lot, right? Because we can say a lot of different sentences and understand what a person's saying. It's an incredibly generative system for communication, one person to another. So when people in psychology think about different aspects of language, levels of language, they often divide it something like this. Phonology is the sounds of language that we hear, that we acquire as infants, that we use to speak to one another. Syntax, grammar, and by this isn't like school grammar, not get the sentence right. It's just the understanding of the organization of words and how that changes the meaning of the sentence. Syntax. Semantics, what do the words mean? What do the groups of words mean? Pragmatics, and we'll talk about each of these a little bit. Sometimes, a person is sarcastic. So you go, that was an awesome lecture yesterday in psychology. Somebody could say that in 100 trillion years. And you go, yeah, right? Okay. So that's the pragmatics versus semantics. Then, of course, it's not just sentences. We have whole discussions. And another aspect of language we'll just touch on a little bit today is the emotional comprehension and production. The tone somebody speaks in, the tone you produce are also informative. So there's many aspects of language. We'll start with sort of the most basic, or phonology. So phonemes are the words that people use to describe the building blocks of speech sounds. So boy versus toy differ by one phonemes. Phonemes are the building blocks of the sounds of language. Human use about 100 phonemes across languages, but any given language only uses a subset. And this has really interesting consequences. Of course, a language could only exist in the world if you could understand those phonemes. Phonemes that are ununderstandable aren't going to be part of anybody's language. But different languages, for historical reasons, have ended up using different subsets of phonemes. And we'll come back to that. When we're babies, for about the first 6 months of our lives, we're universal learners. We know all the phonemes and we respond to all of them. As we become native language speakers and listeners, we become only good at the ones that are used in our language, and our ability to even recognize the ones that are not in our language disappears. You can get it back some, but the older that you are, you never get it back fully. So we're universal learners at birth, but we become enslaved to the language that we are native speakers of and listen to within months of birth. English has about 45, so it's more than the number of letters we have. And sometimes people get confused a little bit that letters are phonemes. They're not. So, hot and cold have the O, hot and the O sound and cold are different sounds, same letter. So there's many more phonemes. Even in English, when they say it's about 45, depending on dialects, you can have a couple more or a couple less. So again, we're born to use all of them, and we use them or lose them. It's not, we don't entirely lose it, but we're never as good if we try to learn a distinction once we become older than that. Humans understand speech at an incredible rate. Typical fast talking is about 180 words a minute, 14 phonemes a second in a continuous speech stream, but people can go up to 250 words. We're incredibly fast language processors, incredibly fast language processors. So how do we roughly conceptualize in the most simple way, what we have to do to get to a word that we hear, to get to its meaning? Well, acoustic information comes to the ear. Those are, waveforms, physical things arriving at our ears. We sort of, in some way, figure out how those correspond to phonemes and then map that in some way to words that have meanings in the world. And the reason why machines understanding what you say is shockingly hard to do a good job on is for the following reason. There's a huge difference between a word by the time your mind understands what it is and the nature of the signal that arrived at your ear. So we talked a lot about that in terms of the retina and vision, right? You have this very impoverished stuff that arrives on your retina, and then the whole rest of your brain, millions and millions of neurons and synapses, reconstruct what's out there from a very impoverished retinal input. And the same thing happens in audition. What gets to your ear is incredibly impoverished, and the rest of your brain has to brilliantly reconstruct what it heard and assign it to meaning. And so part of the challenge of your mind and brain to do that is this. This is a representation of something like the physical signal that arrives at your ear. And you could say, well, here's one word, here's another word, what's the problem? Okay? But this is all the signal that arrives at your ear for the word captain. So here's the C, all this stuff for the A, a period of long silence that sets up the P. Okay? Turns out, I'll convince you of this in a moment, that our speech is full within words of silent breaks that are incredibly informative and alter our perception of what's physically going on. Then the little T, this long stuff for the AI, this long stuff for the N. So the physical signal to your ear, barely resembles what seems like a single unit, captain, right? And where is that pause when a person doesn't say cap, or doesn't say cut, 1, 2, 3, patain, right? Okay, but but the pause is happening, and it's incredibly informative, as I'll show you. So that's the incredible thing. Your auditory system, your language system, has to reconstruct the sound into phonemes, into words. It's not obvious from the physical signal in the ear. It's not even that the physical signal at the ear gives you much information at the outset about whether you're hearing one word or two words or three words. So here's what and do you mean as one big blend. Where is do, where's you mean? And why does what look so separate? And these three words, what do you mean, get all garbled together, and you have to unpack them by your brain and mind. Here's another example. John said that the dog snapped at them. The dog snapped. Here's what's coming roughly to your ear, taken from spoken speech. And here again, notice that the boundaries that you can see here, the gaps of silence, occur not very related to the boundaries between the words that your mind ultimately understands. So here's the word the, dog. Here's S for snapped. Here's a good pause. But that's the pause between the P sound and the T sound. I mean, that looks like a good word boundary. To a machine, that's a very good word boundary. Okay? It's not a word boundary for you. You know snapped is one word. And here comes at. At is kind of blended into the T, right? So there's this physical signal. It doesn't even give you breaks where words separate from one another. It's kind of a continuous mix of breaks and silences. So here's to convince you that a silence carries incredible information in it. Let's see, make sure I have the volume. Okay, so I'm going to play you this. This is the physical signal to your ear, the word say. Say. Okay. Then yeah? Okay. All right. I always worry because Tyler's an expert in this, and I'm always like, please, Tyler, don't embarrass me when I'm wrong. Okay. You don't have this pressure out there, but the teaching assistants are all experts in something or another, and then they know more often than I do in that topic, and we hit their topic in the course. I'm looking over there nervously. Okay. So, so here's say. Now, they're going to take this thing and just separate this, just in the way you do a physical signal on a computer, just separate in time. They're just going to add a little bit of time. And what do you hear? Stay. The T sound that is simply adding silence here to produce that. Now, that's what you hear all the time. It's not a random choice. But isn't it amazing that silence is as ultimately informative for your mind as actual language sounds themselves? And all this is happening on the order of thousandths of a second in bits of information. That's bad enough. Here's another amazingly tough thing. So people like to compare consonants that have a lot of similarities but some interesting differences, ba and da. So it's really comparing B versus D. It's throwing on the A just to have a vowel sound. So here again is a representation of what's coming to your ear. Notice that all the difference between the B and the D, these two consonants, all the physical difference is occurring in 40 thousandths of a second. 40 thousandths of a second is all the physical difference that you get as you hear these two things. 40 thousandths of a second. And yet, you know, you can hear the word bad, and you're not going bad, dab. Come on, that was thousandths of a second, right? And not only that, there'd be another word in a sentence. That's why people use the word speech stream, and we could think of it as a speech torrent, right? Phonemes, 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 breaks, all garbled together, and your mind has to go back and constantly, instantly, and brilliantly figure out what you heard. So let me give you another example, because part of the challenge of this are phonemes occur in the context of words and sentences. So make sure I have good volume on this. OK, so let's do this first one. What was that? What? OK. Here's the same thing, and a person is going to say this now all by itself.
Little.
You got that, right? OK.
Mary saw the 3 little pigs in the corridor.
OK, but here's the amazing thing. The first sound you heard, and I'll replay it, they took the word little, and they cut it out from the last sentence you heard. When little is said all by itself, what comes to your ear is literally the first thing you heard. Not this, because when you say a word in isolation, little, people say it differently. But we almost never talk like that. We almost always have a sentence. And it turns out the way we say things, and therefore the way you hear things, is hugely influenced by what comes before it and what comes after it. Never mind things like the speed at which different people talk, the accent they talk, or the loudness of the background conversation, okay? But just simply, the fact that you're going to say little by itself, how does that work? It's amazing, right? Listen again. If you heard little all by itself, and it's exactly the same physical signal, maybe it's not so amazing. Okay? Let me try that again. That's exactly the same physical signal, exactly the same physical signal as...
Mary saw the 3 little pigs in the corridor.
What you hear easily as little is exactly that. Words in isolation, and this is a great demonstration. If you hear a word cut out, the reason why it sounds like nothing is your mind is already preparing how to interpret that given what you heard just before it, and also a little bit what you hear just after it, okay? Your mind is constantly fixing up things because it knows what's going on, what's going into it, what's coming out. It's not because it just simply hears the word itself. Right? If we lived in a world where people just do one word every half an hour, you know, we could do this. In a world where we're talking to each other in sentences all the time, we have to do this. Here's another example of our brilliant auditory system for hearing these kinds of things. So again, these are representations of how this physical signal arrives at your ear. Here's the word bet, bee, boat, and bird. They all start with the same B sound. That's easy, right? But look what came to your ear. Look at this signal, this signal, this signal. Look at this one. How different does this look? It's different because what follows bird influences how this is said. But you can see that you translate both of these into the B sound pretty easily. Now look at these words. These all start with D. Look at how bet and det look almost identical. We said it's only 40 milliseconds difference, 40 thousandths of a second difference of physical signal through your ear. But you can tell the word bet versus det. And look at the word D, how different it looks from word to word. So your mind is constantly figuring out what you're hearing, the problem of invariance, and it's constantly coming to you in incredibly variable ways, okay? All right. So one of the tools we have, and an amazing human capacity, is what's called categorical perception. So we have all this huge range of physical sounds that can come to our ear, and kind of brilliantly, and you don't even think about it. I mean, none of you go around bragging about your categorical perception abilities, right? Like when you go to spring break, right? And maybe some of you will go home or you'll see friends and you won't go, I have categorical perception. I try to be modest about it, but it's an amazing human talent and essential, because what it does is this. We hear this huge range of sounds depending on accents, what comes before, what comes after, and we have to decide that's a B. And what you're going to do is take this huge range of things and just go, boom, it's a B or a D, and that's all there is to it. So here's the way they do it. So categorical perception, sounds can vary continuously. We showed you some of this continuity. In this experiment on purpose, they're going to vary sounds in a very continuous physical way. But in our heads, for ba and da here, in our heads, all the stuff that's over here, even though they're very different one from the other at a physical, specific level, we'll say, ba, I'm done with it. We're going to put it into one category for interpretation. And you're going to have a pretty sharp boundary here, and everything over here, all these physical signals, you're going to call pa. And so you're not going to spend a lot of time going, that was a 1/3 ba, 2/3 pa probability. We couldn't do that, right? Because you couldn't get through a word, never mind a sentence. You're going to instantly group huge numbers of things that are they're different from one another into two categories that need to be separated. So here's the kind of experiment they do. I'll just give you the feeling of it. Here's where they're varying, in constant units. Constant units, every stimulus here is different. But every time you hear ba, and they're constantly going to vary something about its physical property, you always call it a B. And then something happens in about 20 milliseconds of information, and boom, you always call it a P. Okay? So change in the physical signal, you call it one category. A little bit more change, boom, it's the other category. And you keep changing, but for you, it's always a perfectly good P, even though every one of those are different. All right? So it's an amazing fundamental capacity to take a huge, and for all practical purposes, an infinite variety of inputs and say it's a B or a P if that's the world I'm working in. Syntax. That's another way in which we understand things, the way that words are organized in their order. So we could say, the model embraced the designer and the photographer. Imagine somebody saying to this, but then they complete the sentence. The model embraced the designer and the photographer laughed. Okay? So people who study syntax really are interested in what happens in your mind as you hear the model embraced the designer and the photographer, and some big group hug is going on, right? And then all of a sudden you get this word laughed, and all you have to do is rearrange the elements in your mind. That's what syntax is letting you do, to say, oh, the meaning is really quite different. Okay, there's only one hug going on and one person laughing at them, right? But the meaning over time, as somebody talks to you, is set up. You're thinking this, boom. Because you understand syntax, you understand what happened. Semantics are kind of more straightforward. They're how we usually think about them. They're the meanings of words or sentences, morphemes. And we can understand semantics even when the sentence is nonsense. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously is a famous example. But we can understand semantics even in bad grammatical sentences, right? Fastly eat dinner, ball game starts soon. Your fifth grade teacher would be up in arms to hear that, but you understand, eat now, go see the ball game, right? Okay, so we get through a lot of stuff to get semantics, and we can see interactions. I stole this example from Ted Gibson because it took me like 20 minutes to figure out what the sentence means. You're probably faster than I am. Yeah, are you okay? I'm going, the old man, where's the missing words? Or the old man the boats, okay? So, this is how you have to parse up the sentence. It's not always obvious. People who study language love these things where people are all confused. Most of our lives, we don't go through that much confusion, but there's some fun ones, sort of like the visual illusions, to point out how meaning and syntax can interact as you figure out things. Here's another example. Jay Leno talked about sex with Lindsay Lohan. You go, okay, now wait a minute. Did I miss that excellent episode of Jay Leno? Or was she on the show and talking about, saying, I'd rather not talk about my recent conviction. I'd rather talk about something less controversial. Okay, so semantics, all these things are constantly interacting in your mind. It's kind of amazing when you think about that, right? We said phonology is amazing. Semantics, syntax, boom, they're all happening in you. And none of you are sitting there going, just did phonology. Please don't ask me to do semantics, We just had midterms, right? Brilliant. So one of the ways that people try to convince themselves that these things are separable and gives a little bit more insight is evoked response potentials. Those are these things that you can measure on infants or adults that measure electrical activity in milliseconds and the speed of language processing, surface electrodes that give you an index of hundreds of a few 100,000 neurons. And this is an example you saw before, actually, earlier in the course, the so-called N400. So N means whether the wave is going up or down, negative or positive. 400 means it occurs about 400 milliseconds, about half a second after the relevant event. So here's this, let's see. It was his first day at work. That's the baseline. He spread the warm bread with socks. Oh my gosh, socks, semantically bad. And here comes the N400, okay? And the control condition is you throw up this unexpected word, shoes. That's weird, but not semantically, and you get quite a different response. So here's an N400 that seems to be about semantic expectation or congruence. How about if you mess up syntax, the spoiled child throw the toys on the box, then you get a response at about 600 milliseconds to syntactic incongruity. So this is just more evidence that in the brain, meaning or semantics and syntax or something about word order are processed somewhat differently in time and place. Pragmatics is kind of fun. It's practical understanding, right? The old joke, do you know what time it is? And the person says yes. They're messing with your sense of pragmatics. Two negatives make a positive, so you go, yeah, I've heard that one before earlier in the lecture. Now, here's something kind of interesting, again, which is remarkable. And if you didn't do the experiment, you couldn't know that our mind is like this, because you wouldn't do things like this except because it sounds too ridiculous. But your mind does it all the time. So we're going to think about the word bugs. And I have to set you up a little bit with paradigms you've heard before, but just remind you of these things. So one kind of task that psychologists like to use to think about how people process words is a lexical decision task. All you're deciding is whether a word is a real word or a nonsense word. Okay? So doctor is real, proctor is not, spy is a real word, this spelling is not a real word. Okay? So a real word, not a real word. We also talked about one other idea earlier in the course, that if prior to processing a word like doctor, you get an unrelated word or a related word, you process doctor faster if you had a related word before it, semantic priming. The ideas about nurse overlap a lot with the ideas about doctor, and seeing this word before makes you process this word faster. So you need those two things in mind. What's the person doing? Is it a real word or not? And you're going to mess with what's in their mind before that, related or unrelated. And here's the experiment. So you would hear over headphones something like this as an example. Rumor has it that for years, the government building had been plagued with problems. Now here's the critical sentence. The man was not surprised when he found several spiders, roaches, and other bugs in the corner of his room. So there's two senses of the word, at least two meanings of the word bug, right? The insect you don't want in your soup, or the microphone that somebody slipped into your room to listen to what's going on. Two different meanings for the word bug. This is obviously about the insect. So the person's hearing this over headphones, and on a computer monitor in front of them, after they hear the word bugs here, they see, for a lexical decision, the word ant, which is related to this meaning, or spy, which is related to the other meaning that's not relevant for here, or so, which is the control condition. We'll ignore that. Okay, that's just a control condition. I'll ignore that for the moment. So you're making a lexical decision now on the related meaning or the unrelated meaning. And here's what they find. If it's the related meaning, and you only have about a half second from when that came on to when you had to do this task, so you saw the word bug, and here comes this, you're faster. But if you get the unrelated meaning within a half a second of processing the word, you're also faster. What this means is your mind has done exactly what you would think it wouldn't do. Your mind has looked up in your brain and in your knowledge of vocabulary every meaning of the word. Even though the sentence is clearly setting you up for the word, the insect meaning, isn't it? Every meaning of your word is turned on and available to you. Your mind does the opposite of what you might think. You might think, well, I know, let's look at the sentence. I know once I get spiders, roaches, and bugs. By here, you know you're in the insect world, not in the world of spies, right? Okay? But your mind, even then, looks up every possible word because it's cheaper for the mind to look up every word than to start to decide what the appropriate word is. And then if you wait another second and a half, you're only fast for the selected meaning. And now you're slowed down for the one that's not context relevant. So your mind looks up everything all the time, every meaning of every word you know. Every time that word pops up, it seems like your mind looks up every meaning, and then the rest of your mind selects out the one that's relevant and shuts down the ones that are not. But you wouldn't think that. You'd think maybe I'll just get the one I need. I'm not going to get everything. It's like I'm not going to put all my clothes on, walk outside, and take off everything that's not relevant for the weather, right? All right? That seems like really like a inefficient way to get dressed, right? But that's not the way your mind is. Your mind, it's cheaper and more efficient to look up every meaning every time and then pick the right one. It's more efficient, and that's how people do it. So people use this word exhaustive lexical access. I'll look up every meaning of a word, and then I'll pick out the correct one. Another interesting aspect of that could be brought into pragmatics, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the course, but emotional intonation. And it turns out whereas almost all language processes are left dominant, as we've talked about many times in the course, one stream of processing language, both visual and auditory, is right hemisphere dependent, and that's emotional intonation. And that brings us to our reading for today from Oliver Sacks. And I have to say, I think Oliver Sacks is a phenomenal author, but there's always been the sense of like some of these stories are just a bit too true to be, just a bit cute or whatever it is. And so for years I taught for this story, and I believe it's likely true, but I thought, well, it's just a little cute. And then came an experiment that showed it's not only cute, but it's exactly correct. Okay, so for this, you will appreciate this a bit more if you know a couple things about Ronald Reagan, who was president in the 1980s. So what do you guys know about Ronald Reagan? What party was he? Okay, there you go. Was he considered a good communicator? Yes, he was considered. You can have all kinds of views on Ronald Reagan's things. The public said he's an awesome communicator. In fact, Barack Obama said he would like to communicate like Ronald Reagan, all right? Whether that's to get Republican votes or not, it's your judgment. But he was considered an excellent communicator. Was he considered, by and large, to be an extremely analytic thinker? He might have been, I don't know him, but not so much. Now, part of this is the prejudice or not that he's from California, and he was an actor before he became a president and a governor-president. He also had some degree he ultimately had Alzheimer's disease. There's a question about late in his administration whether he was already working his way towards that. So anyway, complicated things. But he was a master communicator, but not necessarily, the Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter version of analytic power. It's a general perception. You never know whether these are right or wrong, but for the person. But in this story, listening to the president's speech are patients with aphasia that Oliver Sacks described, and he's getting laughter as they're watching his speech. And what happens is some of the people with the left hemisphere lesions, they have a language problem. We'll see a video of that pretty shortly. They're laughing because they sort of think the way he's talking and his facial expressions, they find hilarious, okay? Now, why do they find it hilarious? They have a damage to the parts of the brain that help them understand the content of his message on the left hemisphere. And here's what Sacks thinks is going on. The feelings I have, which all of us who work closely with aphasics have, is that you cannot lie to an aphasic. He cannot grasp your words and so be deceived by them. But what he grasps with infallible precision, namely the expression that goes with the words, that total spontaneous involuntary expressiveness which can never be simulated or faked, or words alone can hide, sometimes too easily. So, when you give a very public speech, especially under tough circumstances that presidents sometimes have to do, we sometimes think there's a tension between exactly what they're saying and exactly what they're thinking, okay? And what they feel they need to say, and exactly what they know behind the scenes. And so the idea is that these aphasics they were saying, this guy obviously doesn't mean what he's saying. Look at his face, look at his tone. I don't know what he's saying, but it's hilarious how he's masking his face and speaking in a funny tone to tell something he truly doesn't believe. Okay? That's their interpretation. And he has an opposite patient, a patient with a right hemisphere lesion. We said that's the side of the hemisphere that seems important for facial expressions and emotional intonation. And she complains about the logic of the case he's making. As if having, normally when we talk to somebody, it's both. Left hemisphere is getting the content, analyzing the content. Right hemisphere is something about the intonation, true or not true. Are their eyes like this and they can't even face us as they tell us something they know is false, okay? So, but these patients, maybe because they have one channel of information knocked out because of injury, they become hypersensitive to the other one, all right? So I thought, well, that sounds fantastically, interesting, but, is that really true? So here in Boston, they did a study with a large number of patients. That's a superior identification of people who are lying to you. They had made video clips and audio clips of people who are lying to you if they had a left hemisphere lesion. So this is the paper. So here's the two examples. So they would have an example. Let's pick this one, where both you see just the facial expression of a person talking. The voice is turned down. Your job is to decide whether a person is lying or not. Okay? And some videos are lying, some videos they're not. So how would you do? Well, I don't know how you would do, but I can tell you how a group of Harvard undergraduates did. 50% is chance, and here's how they did. Okay? That was one of their control groups. And in fact, for studies like this, they brought in many, many kinds of people to ask whether anybody is better. Everybody's pretty much terrible at directly telling whether a lie is going on. Now, these are video clips of people you don't know and circumstances you don't know. That could matter. But everybody is terrible at that. Policemen are terrible. FBI agents are terrible. The only group that seems to be above chance and not much above it are Secret Service agents. Okay? So if you're a friend with a Secret Service agent and you want to deceive them, keep in mind that they seem to be above chance. They're not awesome, but they're above chance. But look who's doing better than everybody. Patients with the left hemisphere lesions. And the interpretation is all the content of the lie is gone. All they see is your expression or your expression and intonation. And because that's all they have to go on, they can tell more when you have the discomfort of lying than a person who's partly persuaded by hearing the message you're sending as you talk. So I thought this was an overly cute example, but it turns out to be exactly replicable in a full study. Any question about that? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the brain basis of language. We've talked a little bit about, we know that if you have damage here, you have Broca's aphasia in the left hemisphere, trouble producing language. Damage here, Wernicke's aphasia, trouble comprehending language. To a first approximation, and there's a lot of research that has made this much more complicated, but to a first approximation, the lesions are in frontal cortex or temporal cortex. The speech in these patients are what's called non-fluent or telegraphic. They get single words out but have a hard time, anything like a sentence. It can be very frustrating for these patients. Wernicke's patients seem much happier. You'll see a film in a moment. Their speech is fluent, but it's amazingly empty of content. Okay? These patients have trouble producing speech, but their comprehension is decent. These patients produce speech pretty well, but their comprehension. So they're sort of mirror opposites. And let's see, what do I want? Yes. So in this field, an incredibly frequently used picture to study aphasia is this specific picture. It's called the cookie theft picture. Why it's become widely used, I'm not exactly sure, but once it's widely used enough that everybody uses it, okay? So they'll put a picture like this in front of an individual, and they'll ask them to describe what's going on. It's to elicit production. And you would say something like, there's two kids, the kid's on a stool, they're going to fall over because they're falling off the cookie jar, and the mother's sort of not paying attention. Her mind must be somewhere else because she's letting the water splish splash here, right? That's what you'd say, something like that. Okay. So let's see what patients with aphasia say and other examples of their difficulty with language. Yeah.
I know they can't talk, but can they write down what they mean?
The writing tends to go pretty much with their spoken language. Okay, that's a really good question about, so the question is, what would the writing be like? It very much parallels their spoken language. Yeah? Sorry? Okay, so this is a really very good question. Could non-fluent aphasics learn sign language to bypass, in a sense, their problem, right? So I'm about to answer that in a moment, right on the next slide. Not directly that, but the implication of that, right? Okay, because the important thing is, so let me show you this thing and let me come back. The question is, could you train an aphasic to use sign language to get around his or her language problem, right? If it's a speech problem. So people have studied sign language as a language for many reasons, but a huge one is this. Because I'm going to interpret your question the way I need to, and then you can tell me if I did it right from your perspective, which is, in what sense is language equal speech, right? Because could you communicate linguistically but just switch to your hands if for some reason, and the answer is that at the level of the problem of these patients, they could not do it. Because these kinds of patients, the problem isn't really speech. There are people who have problems with the motor apparatus to move their mouth, that does exist. Their problem is in language processes that produce your speech intent, okay? Or language processes that extract meaning from sounds. And those language processes that produce what you want to say, that comprehend what you hear or read, those are the same ones that are utilized, as far as we understand, whether you're producing language in the typical vocal way or in the less typical but well-studied way of sign language. Does that make sense? Okay. So you can't get around it because it's a language problem. Both by brain imaging evidence, for example, here are patients who use sign language turning on Broca's area and Wernicke's area on tasks that are about comprehension and production. It's the same areas, whether it's using your hands for sign language or using your mouth to talk or your ear to hear. Further, there have been really fun studies where they took deaf infants and have shown, and it's not easy to show it, but I think most people are convinced, that they babble with their hands, the same way babies make little sounds to get themselves going. We'll talk more about infants in a moment. Infants who grow up in an environment where they only learn sign language babble with their hands because speech, language is not about your mouth talking. It's about ideas that you can communicate by your production or comprehension by your hand or by your mouth. So language is separable from speech because even without speech, you communicate in very much the same way in terms of sign language by many studies. Yeah?
So does that mean that people, that they also couldn't imagine words or language?
Say that again, sorry.
Does that mean that they also couldn't imagine words or language?
Who could?
The people with the Broca's area aphasia?
I don't think so. We've talked about this before, that I may not be understanding your question exactly, but that in many ways, imagining something is the same part of the brain that does it. When we imagine a face, we turn on the parts of our brain that sees. I think when you imagine, if you say, I do this sometimes, I say, here's what I'm going to say to that person in my head, okay? And I practice that little speech. That's this part of the brain pretty much running, okay? There's just a last little step of moving your mouth. But that's, from the discussion we're having now, that's kind of a superficial thing of moving your mouth, okay? That's not speech planning, speech thinking, speech intentions. Those are a core process for production, for comprehension. And I think imagined stuff is exactly the same way. Is that okay? Yeah. Yeah?
So if they can't really imagine language, then what is their thinking like? Can they communicate anything about their thinking?
Yeah, that's a good. So the question is, if they have these troubles with core language ideas, abilities, what's their thinking like? I can just tell you that it's a sort of a classic debate for humans how deeply language equals thought. But language now in the sense of speech, okay? It's just one of those things that people debate a lot because it depends what you mean by these things in many different ways. But if language means something like comprehending ideas in the world, it's hard to get around that for thinking about it. If it means planning actions in the world that change the world around you and communicating that, it's hard to not have that capacity for thinking in that way, right? So it's at this level, not whether you use your hands or your mouth, it's very hard to separate out what you might call thought and what you might call language. But keep in mind that these patients that we see, it's not like they lost all of language at all. So even though the broke his face across trouble producing language, he's produces some, and he comprehends it pretty well. So it's not like these patients have lost all of their language circuitry and therefore don't have thought available, right? They have a lot of language left in their head and a lot of thought left in their mind. Is that okay? All right. So one interesting thing that people have wondered, and where brain imaging gives us evidence that we couldn't have imagined 15 years ago, is this. So if you have damage, let's say here's a patient with damage to the left frontal area, and they get better because they've had a stroke here or an injury here, they get better. A question that people have wondered is, do they get better by sort of somehow recovering ability in the part of the brain that got injured? Or do they get better because they use an entirely different pathway in their brain? Now, until brain imaging, you couldn't begin to touch that question. But now we have some evidence, and then I'll make it just. And so here's an example of a patient who has damage here. They have him do a task that in healthy people turns on exactly that place. And when he does it, he can do it OK. And where does he do it? In his right hemisphere. So this patient seems to switch which hemisphere he uses for language. It takes time and training to recover that. But it seems like he's found an alternate pathway to produce a language somehow. Turns out that the more people have studied these things, the more complicated it gets. Maybe just the diversity of people, the diversity of injuries, or whatever. So it doesn't always work this way. But often it seems like when people have better recovery from a large injury to the speaking left hemisphere, they find a way somehow through practice and training to get the right hemisphere to take over some of those responsibilities. OK, language acquisition. So one of the most amazing things about infants, right, is they go from 0 to speech in just a couple of years and go through an unbelievable training and program of development. So what happens in 2 or 3 months, they perceive all the phonemes. They notice this change in phonemes. By 6 months, they start to ignore distinctions among sounds that are not used in their language, and was other language sounds. They start to babble. That's in some way getting their speech ready to go. By 8 months, they start to identify single words in a speech stream. In a year, their babbling becomes more adult-like sounding. But about a little bit after that, they get up to about 50 words in understanding. So comprehension always goes ahead of production. Children understand words before they can speak them. But in the lagging, here comes a speech, telegraphic speech, short sentences at 2 years. And then, finally, pretty complete speech in many ways by 9. So it's a long, long process, learning, 10,000 words estimated by the age of 6. It's a spectacular learning curve. When they do experiments on infants where they measure things like preference or learning by sucking rates on a nipple because they can't talk, they're trying to figure out what is the infant hearing. Within 2 hours of birth, they suck with more enthusiasm to their mother's voice over another voice. These are infants. This is their first visit to their mother, and you have to sign up to do this experiment. Now, they might have heard their mother's voice in a certain way in the womb, right? So this is not but they already have picked up, by 3-day-old, they prefer language to many other sounds like music. Now, we come to love music, but that's not the urgent business of the infant, okay? By 4 days old, they start to notice differences between languages. This is amazing, right? The rate of learning is fantastic. And by 2 months, they can tell the ba-ga distinction, subtle distinctions, 40 milliseconds information, and they develop a continually strong preference for the sounds of their native language. Now, some years ago, people debated endlessly this left hemisphere specialization for language. This is fantastically essential and striking in humans. Does that grow over time, or is it in your mind and brain at birth? Okay? And the evidence is pretty compelling from many sources, but here's maybe the most. Here's fMRI on 2-day-old infants. You might ask, how do they instruct the infants to lie still in the scanner and participate in the experiment? And the answer is, at 2 days old, infants mostly just lay there and don't do much. Okay, all right. I mean, they don't do much. I mean, there's a lot going on in their mind, but they don't have much physical apparatus to do much. So you could swaddle them very warmly. You just you put them on a cradle into the fMRI scanner. Their parents have signed up, for them. And you can play them sounds while they just lay there and do nothing. They can't push buttons, they can't do stuff, but you can see what's happening inside their brain. And at 2 days old, here's the left hemisphere response to language compared to the right. So it's there as, instantly, we believe. It's been there, actually, in the womb as the child's been developing. This left hemisphere, genetically set up, dominance for language in almost everybody. fMRI, just for those of you who, again, we can start doing it at about age 5, but from about 3 months to age 5, it's incredibly hard to do children in a scanner. But the first couple of days, it's not so hard. Now, a really interesting line of research has talked about Motherese. Have you heard this term? So how do grown-ups, even college students, talk to babies? Do you talk to babies just like you talk to everybody else? No. Cute baby, baby, baby. You know, and everybody looks like an idiot, right? Okay. All right. And you could just think, okay, that's just people being idiots around babies. But it turns out there's been beautiful, beautiful studies to show that what you spontaneously do this, and you and I don't take Motherese or Fatherese courses, right? What we do spontaneously is that way of elongating sounds, the intonations we give, are incredibly perfect to help the baby learn language. We're exactly doing what they can understand, okay? And that again, must be virtually in our genes, I think. It's, we hear it around, so it's not zero. But the short pauses, careful enunciation, exaggerated intonation, baby, you can do in experiments where you take language and you get rid of those, and the babies are like, they don't know what's going on, they're not interested. You put them back in, boom. Those are perfect for the baby, okay? So it's amazing not only how babies are ready to go, but how adults who talk with them are ready to go. I mean, it's just amazing, okay? None of us will ever be as good a teacher in a classroom as all of you will be with a baby anytime you talk with them, right? It's just amazing. So there's beautiful experiments that show that every time you tinker with the way that mothers spontaneously or parents spontaneously talk to infants, you make it worse, less interesting, and less informative for the infant. So now let's talk about a more formal experiment to these are the classic experiment that nailed home this message that at birth we're universal understanders of all sounds in the world. And as the years go along, we become only good at the sounds that are relevant, that are part of our own language. A famous example, in the US is a difficulty for Japanese native speakers for the R-L distinction. But every language has some distinctions it doesn't make, and they're really hard when you get older. So here's the idea. In English, we make a distinction between ba and da, and by 10 to 12 months, an infant can make that distinction, and certainly adults can. That's categorical perception that we talked about, that kind of division between ba and da. But there's sounds that occur in other languages, so what's shown here, and you're going to hear, some of you may know Hindi sounds, and it'll be a different experience for you. Every year, when I first hear this clip I'm about to show you, I think something's wrong, because they say, the infant's going to tell the difference between da and da. And I go, well, how are they going to do that? I can't do that. Okay? That's because there really are different sounds they're hearing, but in English, they're not different sounds, and so it all sounds the same. To me, I'm no longer a universal learner, haven't been since quite a while, okay? So here we go. I'm stunned always by the brilliance of infant, researchers like this who somehow, pretty convincingly in most cases, really tell you what the infant knows or pays attention to or thinks in pretty compelling ways, even though they can't tell you themselves. So one thing that's come up in the US, the whole world is becoming ever more bilingual and trilingual. There used to be some concerns, less now, and I'll tell you, you don't have to worry about it, whether it's bad to learn 2 languages at once when you're a kid. And some parents worry about this, right? Are you going to be all messed up because you're going to blend them all up and not do well in school? And so there's been quite a bit of research actually tracking and asking whether there's any downside. There's huge upsides to knowing 2 or 3 languages. Are there any downsides in terms of language development? And the objective evidence is pretty compelling that for babbling, for first words, for pairs of words at a time, things at 2 months, that there's really no cost. So they followed, in Canada, for example, children who grew up learning English and French, English and ASL, French and or English only. Everybody does the same, pretty much. There's no cost, okay, compared to the huge gain. Sometimes some kids will get a little mixed up. They'll actually mix up languages because they'll just mix them up when they're pretty young. But there's no developmental delay or milestones or negative consequences. There's only the benefit of having 2 or 3 languages that you could speak. So the evidence is overwhelming empirically that there's no cost for learning more than 1 language at a time when you're an infant. One thing there is a cost for a little bit if you're a boy. So unknown why this happens. I mean, I don't think there's any deep science about it, but everybody has observed that, for example, number of new words understood during the first 2 years of life, that girls on average outperform boys in language acquisition early on. And then things get closer pretty much, but the rate of learning on girls on average is faster than boys. Nobody, I think, understands the specific basis of that. So people talk about critical periods in language acquisition, and what are fragile or resilient aspects of language. What are aspects of learning language that seem very dependent on the age you are and which are independent. So phonology, including the production of language sounds, seems very fragile, easy when you're young, harder when you're older. Grammar is also age-sensitive, making subtle grammatical distinctions. Learning about meaning or vocabulary, you're perfectly fine when you're an adult. That doesn't seem to show something like a sensitive period. And here's one famous study that established some of these things. They looked at what age people arrived to different countries, from different countries to the US and started learning English. These people didn't know English before. And then they had them do, they're all adults now, and they had them do quickly grammatical judgments. And what they found is if you came to the US if you were born in the US or you came to the age 3 to 7, you were very good at doing this. But the later you came here, 8 to 10 years of age, 11 to 15, 17 to 39, your ability to make these fast, subtle grammatical judgments, just went down. Even though you've been here in many cases for many years, you're very smart. Accents are like that, right? People come to the US at a certain point in their development. They're very skilled in English, have a big vocabulary, but the accent never disappears. That's another thing in terms of language production that has this fragile developmental early period. So the last thing I'll do, and then show you a movie for about 8 minutes. One of the we get these occasional sort of horrible experiments. It's not even an experiment of nature, it's just an experiment of horrible human behavior. And the most famous one in language development, which had a huge impact on the field at the time, is a child, Genie. I'll show you, you'll see her in a movie clip in a moment. They discovered her locked in a room in a house from age 20 months approximately until they discovered her at 13. She almost spoke to no one. So the people taking care of her locked her in a closet basically and did not talk with her, or she had no language interactions until she was discovered and rescued. And then they performed research for years saying, what could she learn things, what could she not learn? She got single words, for example, but she never got particularly good at grammar, or syntax. So a sort of brutal way to test the idea that what's acquirable later in life, and what, if you don't learn it early in life, is possible to acquire fully. So I'll end with this. We'll do this for like 5 minutes or 7 minutes. I'll stop there. It's summarized in your book. Everybody knows about it because it's this study you couldn't do ethically, in a million years, right? You would never do, which is if you deprive a child during a critical period of language exposure. And she never got lots of aspects of language going. She got okay on, a minimal vocabulary and grew in other ways, but many of the things from a language perspective she never got because she missed that critical period. So that's a bit of a sad story, obviously, but have a good spring break and a refreshing spring break, and I'll see you in 10 days.